In 2018 to 19, there was 9.3 million visitors to Australia from overseas, which was the highest year on record. Tourism may be good towards the country's economy, but it also can cause the same forms of pollution as other industries, such as air emissions, noise, solid waste, littering, and releases of sewage. Considering all the tourism-related expenditures, it can add up to 4.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide greenhouse gases a year, which is also 8% of global emissions. Travelling nationally and exploring your own country can help reduce carbon emissions by avoiding flying internationally and reducing the use of single-use items that many airlines use on their airplanes. This can also help smaller communities gain tourism and help boost their economy. And while travelling within your own country, you can help reduce your carbon footprint and give you the opportunity to explore and see your own country.
We began our concept stage with a blue sky approach. Firstly, we highlighted the obvious issues of global tourism: carbon emissions, cultural and environmental degradation, those sort of things. How would these factors, left unchecked, impact local communities and ecosystems? Is the issue purely physical, or was it cultural and spiritual? The simplest approach would be to encourage people to explore their own country, avoiding the unnecessary travel and infrastructure of a global industry, but would this cause more harm than good? What would happen to international communities dependent on visitors, or the extensive tourist infrastructure already built? What are the people that want to experience the world, or the repercussions of narrowing our borders? The more we explored the challenges, the more value we saw in the topic. With the tourism industry generating untold billions and causing untold environmental destruction, a solution, even partial, could have incredible effect. With all of this considered, we finally had our project question: how might we employ national tourism to encourage sustainability?
For our user personas, we agreed that the number of end users was limitless, so in an attempt to get a wide dataset, we created 7. These were intended to cover a range of personalities, from the typical family man on holiday to the local tour guide. By being so broad, we were able to capture insights into how other users would be impacted by our project solution. We then created an archetype wheel to better inform the development of our personas. Finally, we created stakeholder maps that informed the relationships between the personas. This was also done so that we could not only see the overlaps, but also the more nuanced differences in the stakeholders.
For our user journeys, we decided to get into the head of the typical tourist family. We began by mapping out a routine holiday into 12 distinct stages, from research to travel to experience to their return home. This evolved into a series of micro-journeys exploring the key interactions and touchpoints within each stage. From these, we were able to draw associations between our personas, where their paths would cross, how they would interact, and how our project could address their needs. In the hopes of identifying further opportunities, we selected a few of these user journeys and expanded them into scenarios. From there, it became apparent that our attention should be focused on the planning stage, where our solution would influence users to take a more sustainable approach to tourism. These findings were reinforced through extensive empathy mapping, which identified a few useful through lines. Almost all users had cause to benefit from local attractions, were directed by word of mouth, and found value in authenticity and culture. With a good idea of what our audience should be, it was time to start verifying our assumptions. Next, we set about exploring the various systems we would need to consider when designing our project. The first theme we explored was transportation, where we identified the primary systems used for transit during a holiday. These could be broken down into a number of distinct services, each tailored to a specific user but integral to the overall ecosystem. Supplementing these physical systems were digital ones, which serve to inform, educate, and enable various experiences. This is particularly true in the planning portion of the holiday, where research and review are two of the most common activities. Lastly, we looked at the intangible, emotional services provided by tourism. In a country as steeped in nature and culture as Australia, these are understandably prevalent and are central to most tourist experiences. With these systems and services identified, it was time to explore them from the user's perspective.
The way we approached our value proposition canvas was to include 4 personas, as most of the information overlapped. Through this approach, we could compare how our research question related to the needs of a wider group. This was possible because the value proposition was consistent between our personas. Because of the commonalities, I'll be focusing on the family man. The gains that were seen relate mostly to the ideas of family and the experience of travel, while the pains centered around the logistics of travel. It can also be seen that many of the customer jobs are linked to addressing the pains. It should also be noted that an increase in people travelling would negatively affect the existing travel habits of our personas due to congestion.
So we did our surveys using Google Forms. So we did 2 of them. The first one currently has 52 responses and the second one has 12. So we sent these out to lots of places like the Stalker Spaces, so Swinburne, Deakin and Monash Stalker Space, as well as various group chats on Facebook and Discord. This was to get as many people responding as we could from as many different demographics as we could, like while keeping it fairly straightforward. And we didn't want to get like a million answers because it would be very painful to sift through all that data. So we had some key questions like how did people choose their destinations, the logistics of how they normally travel and associated feelings with travel and environmental considerations, as well as what demographic we were interviewing so we could better understand what motivates people.
We compiled the results of these surveys into spreadsheets and began codifying them. Each response was assigned a code that best described what it was attempting to communicate, allowing us to take a macro view on how the audience perceived our questions. We then visualized this information through graphs, providing an easily digestible outlook. This process was repeated until all of our answers were analysed, and with a wealth of information on hand, we could finally begin affinity mapping. As we added to the board, patterns began to emerge. When quizzed on their travel habits, most respondents saw domestic tourism as a short-term option, owing to its accessibility and familiarity, and sought international travel as a form of escapism. When asked about sustainability, many admitted to ignoring it altogether, taking a flippant attitude and being too focused on their fun to care. The more we progressed, the more themes we identified, and, after some reshuffling, ended with 11. These were backed by both pull quotes from our surveys and conclusions from our analyses. This video represents 6 weeks of research, analysis, mapping and interpretation, and has yielded key insights we'll be taking into our project solution. Firstly, we've identified that domestic tourism has a far lower environmental impact when compared to international travel. Secondly, we've recognised the sprawling audience of potential users in Australia and come to empathise with their needs. And lastly, we've pinpointed the systems and services comprising the tourism economy, which will need to be factored into our eventual solution. With all of this considered, we're almost ready to answer our question: how might we employ national tourism to encourage sustainability?